28 individuals Johnny Carson loathed with such intensity that he barred them from his stage forever. The ruthless monarch of late-night TV, for 30 years, Johnny Carson dominated the late-night airwaves, captivating audiences with his iconic grin and what appeared to be boundless charisma. Families across America welcomed him into their private sanctuaries, convinced they understood the gentleman sitting behind the desk, the friendly Midwesterner capable of relaxing even the most nervous guest. However, concealed beneath that genial surface lurked a vastly different version of Johnny Carson, a figure possessing a long memory, profound, deeply rooted insecurities, and the terrifying authority to annihilate a professional reputation with a solitary utterance. Johnny was not one to forget a slight, nor was he one to offer forgiveness, disclosed a former Tonight Show producer who spent over 15 years in Carson's orbit. Betray him a single time, and you were not merely scratched from that evening's lineup, you were effectively expunged from his empire entirely. While Johnny hailed from the plains of Nebraska, his code of conduct was more akin to a Sicilian mob boss, observed a close, lifelong companion. He never shouted. He avoided making dramatic scenes in the public eye. Instead, he simply excised individuals from his existence with surgical precision. And considering his titanic standing in the business, that erasure carried ramifications that extended far beyond missing a single gig. What remains most startling were the ostensibly trivial missteps that could land a performer on Carson's eternal blacklist. While certain guests merited their bans through truly wild and outrageous antics, others found themselves cast out for transgressions so nuanced they remained oblivious to their error until the damage was irreversible. This evening we are pulling back the curtain on the 8 visitors who violated Carson's unwritten laws. The celebrities who discovered themselves permanently banished from television's most influential stage, frequently suffering catastrophic outcomes for both their professional trajectories and personal lives. And although the treachery involving Joan Rivers stands as the most notorious of these career-shattering incidents, it was merely the opening chapter in Carson's merciless strategy toward those who dared to double-cross him. Several of these prohibitions remained in force for nearly 20 years, only dissolving after Carson's passing, allowed new hosts unburdened by the king's old vendettas to take the reins. But before we dive deeper, we must examine the disloyalty that shattered Carson's spirit and birthed the most legendary conflict in broadcast history, an injury so profound that not even the finality of death could completely mend the rift. The betrayals. My upcoming guest needs no introduction. You all recognize Joan Rivers. She is currently performing at the Plaza 4 right here in Century City. She will be gracing that stage for the remainder of the week. Number 1, Joan Rivers, the protege whose defection crushed Carson's soul. Joan Rivers was never just a random comic filling a slot on The Tonight Show. She was Johnny Carson's chosen successor, the talent he personally selected and mentored to become the very first permanent guest host in the program's long timeline, a title that transformed her into one of the most dominant figures in the comedy world essentially overnight. Johnny provided Joan with more than just a stage. He gave her his unspoken seal of approval, clarified arts scriptwriter who collaborated with both humorists. In a business where female comics were still scraping and clawing for fundamental dignity, securing Carson's validation was comparable to being knighted by royalty. He single-handedly constructed her career. Their working dynamic had matured into a bona fide personal bond as the years passed. Carson offered guidance on Rivers' jokes, welcomed her to exclusive dinner parties, and openly lauded her comedic brilliance during an age when women in the field were frequently ignored. For Rivers, Carson evolved into a paternal protector within a cutthroat system where she frantically required a champion. Joan often remarked that Johnny was the initial powerful male figure in broadcasting who demanded absolutely nothing in exchange for his backing, disclosed a close confidant of Rivers. He supported her strictly on the merit of her skills, and she felt an intense gratitude, which explains why the events of 1986 arrived as such a destructive bombshell to Carson. The treachery started in the shadows. Fox, a fledgling network attempting to challenge the supremacy of the Big Three, reached out to Rivers with a staggering proposal, her very own late-night talk program scheduled to broadcast head-to-head against Carson himself. The compensation was rumored to be $10 million annually, an astronomical figure that would position Rivers as the top-earning talent in the late-night arena. However, what made the deal undeniably seductive was Rivers' mounting anxiety regarding her trajectory at NBC. Despite her triumphs as the permanent guest host, network brass had explicitly signaled that when the day came for Carson to step down, Rivers was not on the list of potential successors. Joan was nearing her 50th birthday in a business that is famously cruel to maturing women, observed a historian specializing in television. The bid from Fox represented more than just a paycheck. It offered stability and control over her own destiny. Rivers agreed to the Fox deal, but she immediately confronted an agonizing predicament: how to break the news to Carson, the man who had built her livelihood and whom she truly cherished as both a teacher and a companion. She was petrified of having that discussion. Verified a producer who was on Rivers' team during that era. She continued to procrastinate, praying she would stumble upon the ideal time and the right phrasing. Tragically, that opportunity never arrived. Instead, Fox executives leaked the story to the media before Rivers could inform Carson face to face. He discovered her departure not from her own lips, but by reading a bold headline in Variety magazine. For a man whose early years were defined by emotional neglect, an aloof father, and a mother who refused to offer praise. This apparent double-cross struck at the very heart of Carson's most fragile insecurities. Johnny reportedly turned as pale as a ghost the moment he saw the one staff member present that day remembers the chilling reaction. There was no screaming, no throwing of objects. He simply uttered a quiet realization. She never even picked up the phone and retreated into his private office. That silence cut deeper than any temper tantrum ever could. The retaliation from Carson was instant and total. He immediately issued a decree that Rivers' name was forbidden on The Tonight Show forever. Editors were forced to scrub her from every highlight reel. Guest hosts received strict warnings: do not mention her. It was a complete erasure, as if she had never been part of the program's legacy. He looked at me and said, "To me, she is deceased," recalled Fred de Cordova, the show's veteran producer. And when the king of late night said you were dead, it wasn't a figure of speech. You vanished from his reality entirely. Joan tried desperately to mend the bridge she had burned. She wrote heartfelt letters and dialed his unlisted private line, and even had lavish peace offerings delivered to his estate. Every single effort hit the same brick wall: absolute silence. The packages were rejected with a cold, return-to-sender stamp, her assistant recounted. Her phone calls simply echoed in the void. It felt like she was shouting into a black hole. This blockade wasn't limited to just The Tonight Show. Because Carson ruled the airwaves, Rivers became radioactive at NBC and was shunned by most of the television industry. People she thought were friends suddenly stopped returning calls. Party invites vanished. Her career went into a terrifying freefall. Joan often admitted that the heartbreak of losing Johnny was far more devastating than losing the booking slot, a close confidant noted. She knew she could hustle for work, but the personal rejection haunted her until her last breath. The Iron Curtain remained up for the rest of Carson's reign and long after. Rivers didn't grace that stage again until 2014, 22 years after Johnny retired and 9 years after his passing, when Jimmy Fallon finally broke the curse. By that time, Joan had clawed her way back to the top through grit and hustle, but the emotional scar remained tender. Even at the end of her life, she would tear up talking about him, telling reporters, "He made my life and I betrayed him." That kind of pain sticks with you forever. This brings to mind the T-Mobile Arena, which had only recently opened its doors. And so the conversation shifted to another feud involving Wayne Newton and the backstage threat that went way too far. Newton had been a favorite punching bag for Carson's opening monologues during the 1970s, usually mocking his glitzy Las Vegas persona and what Johnny dubbed his suspiciously ageless face. While the jabs were standard fare for late night comedy, they struck a raw nerve with Newton, who was obsessed with protecting his image. The situation exploded in 1980 when Carson started weaving suggestive cracks about Newton's orientation into his routine. These were dangerous insinuations in that era, the kind of rumors that could completely torpedo an entertainer's livelihood, particularly one catering to traditional crowds. What followed is one of the most legendary face-offs in showbiz history. Wayne didn't lawyer up. He didn't send a manager to whine. He drove to the studio himself, noted a security guard on duty at NBC Burbank that afternoon, and he clearly wasn't there for coffee. Leveraging his fame, Newton breezed past the usual checkpoints and security protocols. marching straight to the host's private sanctuary. Witnesses say he barged in without so much as a knock, catching Carson in the middle of prepping his joke cards. Johnny glanced up startled, but not panicked, recalled an assistant who saw the whole thing start. However, the mood in the room dropped to zero once he realized this wasn't a social visit. While the exact transcript is debated, Newton has since clarified the core of the message in various interviews. By his own account, he leaned in and told Carson, "You can trash my songs, you can mock my hair, but if you crack one more joke about who I sleep with, I will personally beat you to a pulp." For Johnny, who prided himself on fearless comedy and never bowing to pressure, this threat of physical violence crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Johnny stood up very deliberately, the assistant said. Standing significantly taller than the singer, he used his size to his advantage. With a voice like ice, he simply stated, "Get out of my office before I have security throw you out." The standoff ended without a brawl, but the fallout was instant and forever. Carson gave a direct order to his booking agents. Wayne Newton was banned for life. And that ban held firm for the entire remaining 30 years of Carson's dynasty. Johnny could take the heat. He could handle angry feedback, but he had zero tolerance for being physically threatened, explained a producer in Carson's inner circle. To him, Newton was no longer a joke. He was a liability. There was no coming back from that. The Blacklist had a tangible impact on Newton's stardom. While he stayed a king in Vegas, his national TV presence faded. For more hidden stories, subscribe to Legacy Unmasked. Consequences that rippled through his career for years. Without the massive platform of The Tonight Show, which was the lifeblood of mainstream publicity, Newton found his ability to market his latest ventures to a national audience completely crippled. Being blacklisted by the king of late night wasn't just about losing a single TV slot, a former NBC executive observed. It meant being cut off from the most powerful marketing machine in the American entertainment industry. For a performer like Newton, who was desperate to grow his brand beyond his stronghold in Las Vegas, the silence was absolutely devastating. Over the decades, Newton has opened up about the exile, maintaining that he has zero regrets about squaring up to Carson. During a sit-down in 2007, he doubled down, saying, "I'd make the same choice today. Certain principles are worth fighting for no matter the cost to your career." However, this particular ban is fascinating because it peeled back the curtain on Carson's absolute refusal to tolerate anything that sniffed of a physical threat or disrupted the carefully curated sanctuary he built at The Tonight Show. Johnny might overlook a bad joke, a bombed interview, or even a personal dig, but stepping to the man himself, that was the third rail. Once you crossed that line, the bridge wasn't just burned, it was incinerated. Then there was the case of a guest who turned awkwardness into a weapon. Let's talk about Charles Grodin and the moment when anti-comedy went too far. On paper, Grodin seemed like he was engineered in a lab to be Johnny's ideal sparring partner. He was sharp, incredibly smart, and possessed that dry cutting wit that Johnny absolutely adored. However, what started as a fun twist on the usual Hollywood fluff slowly morphed into a bizarre psychological game that deeply unnerved the host, eventually triggering one of the most confusing yet absolute banishments in the show's history. The saga began when Grodin made his debut in the mid-1970s, riding high on the success of The Heartbreak Kid. Most stars walked through those curtains with rehearsed stories and polished charm, but Grodin chose chaos. He decided to play a character, an aggressively difficult version of himself, challenging the premise of Johnny's questions and radiating a vague hostility toward the most powerful man in television. During that first encounter, Johnny was visibly thrown, but being the pro he was, he rolled with the punches, recalled a writer who was on set. Carson was an improv genius. He quickly clocked the bit. He realized Grodin was manufacturing tension to create a new kind of cringe. Comedy, and the crowd. They absolutely loved the friction. That initial spark was electric enough to earn Grodin a return ticket, and then another. But with every appearance, Grodin upped the ante. The persona became darker. What started as playful banter began to feel like a genuine feud. The exchanges grew tense, with Grodin critiquing Johnny's interviewing technique, implying the host was lazy, and accusing him of never actually reading the books he was promoting. He'd even claimed Johnny didn't give a damn about the people on his couch. The issue was, as a director later explained, only the inner circle knew it was a gag. to the millions watching from their living. Rooms, it didn't look like a skit. It looked like a train wreck involving a rude guest and a frustrated host. The boundary between a comedy bit and actual disrespect became dangerously thin. The ultimate crash happened during a broadcast in 1990. Grodin's shtick wandered into a zone. That was strictly off-limits Carson's psyche. Witnesses say Grodin began to mimic Carson's mannerisms and openly questioned his authenticity, asking if Johnny actually liked anyone he spoke to, or if he was just a robotic talking head going through the motions for a massive paycheck. That's when the temperature in the studio dropped. A camera operator on set remembered seeing Johnny's expression freeze. There was the TV smile, and then there was the real Johnny. The crew knew the difference instantly, and this wasn't the happy version. It was the tight-forced grimace of a man who had stopped finding the joke funny. Grodin's jabs were particularly dangerous, because they weren't just insults, they were truths Carson tried to hide. They targeted his biggest insecurity, his struggle. To connect with people on a real emotional level, here was a man with 4 marriages under his belt, known for being emotionally walled off even from his inner circle. Carson hated the implication that his charm was fake. He held it together while the cameras were rolling, maintaining that professional veneer. But the second the red light went off and the show cut to commercial, the mask dropped. He turned to his producer, stone-faced, and said, "We are done with that." A staff member who heard the comment said it was just those 4 words delivered with icy finality. Everyone on the floor knew exactly what had just happened. Grodin never received a formal letter or an angry phone call. He just vanished from the lineup for the rest of Carson's tenure. Whenever his team called to pitch an appearance, they were met with the standard Hollywood no. They were told politely that the show was moving in a different direction, or that the calendar was simply too packed. It wasn't a band born of explosive rage like what happened with other celebrities, noted a booking coordinator. It was a quiet excision. Johnny had simply reached a conclusion. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Why endure that level of awkwardness? He was the king of late night. He had a Rolodex of thousands to pick from. There was no reason to invite a headache back into his home, even if it was technically comedy. In later years, Grodin reflected on the silent exile, admitting that his commitment to the bit might have crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "I thought I was channeling Andy Kaufman," he explained. But Johnny, he just didn't get the joke. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to Legacy Unmasked. The Charles Grodin fiasco served as a stark masterclass in understanding the invisible lines drawn around Johnny Carson. While the king of late night reveled in wit and playful banter, he possessed zero patience for anyone who dared to puncture his authority or cast doubt on the carefully curated image he had polished for decades. Number 4, the Shelley Winters debacle. This was the drink-tossing catastrophe that effectively torpedoed a legendary career. Winters wasn't just some starlet, she was bona fide Hollywood royalty, a 2-time Oscar laureate with a resume stretching back ages, boasting masterpieces like A Place in the Sun, The Diary of Anne Frank, and The Poseidon Adventure. Yet while her brilliance on screen was indisputable by the 1970s, her erratic off-screen antics had morphed into Tinseltown folklore. Shelley was a genius, but a volatile one. A director from that era confessed. She could switch from being the most delightful woman in the room to a volcano of rage in a heartbeat, particularly when the liquor was flowing, which was happening with alarming frequency. Carson had hosted Winters numerous times before usually striking television gold. She was a born raconteur armed with a treasure trove of industry war stories, and her bombastic, larger-than-life charisma guaranteed high ratings. However, behind the curtain, the Tonight Show production team was beginning to dread her appearances. She'd breeze through the pre-interview totally sober, then stumble in for the actual broadcast in a completely altered state of mind, a former talent coordinator revealed. It turned into a high-stakes game of Russian roulette every time we booked her, which Shelley was walking through that curtain. The event that earned Winters her lifetime exile unfolded during a broadcast in 1975 that spiraled into chaos the second she stepped onto the set. According to multiple onlookers, Winters appeared dazed, confused, and was slurring her speech heavily as she sank into the guest seat. Johnny attempted to steer the ship, guiding her gently, but Shelley kept cutting him off, pivoting to nonsensical topics mid-sentence, and rambling in ways that had zero relevance to the questions asked. Recalled a cameraman on duty that fateful night. You could practically feel Carson's muscles tightening, though he fought valiantly to keep the facade of a standard chat alive. The dam finally broke when Carson cracked. What was meant to be a harmless quip about her weight, a subject she had openly mocked herself about in past interviews. This time, the reaction was terrifyingly distinct. "She just lost it," said our stagehand who saw the drama unfold. One moment she was giggling or faking it, and the next moment she launched her entire cocktail squarely into Johnny's face. Not a splash, not a spill, the whole glass of whiskey jagged ice, cubes and all. The studio audience gasped in collective horror. Carson, soaking wet and visibly stunned, managed to signal for a commercial break with icy precision. But witnesses say his legendary composure evaporated the second the red tally light went dark. He stood up dripping and stormed off the set in total silence, producer remembered. His face was a mask of pure fury. In all my time with him, I had never seen him look that ready to kill. Carson retreated to his dressing room, swapped out his ruined suit and tie, and returned to wrap up the broadcast, a testament to his unshakable professionalism. Meanwhile, security swiftly escorted Winters out of the building during the break. The retribution was immediate and absolute. Carson personally ordered his booking staff to blacklist Winters from The Tonight, show forever a decree that held firm for the rest of his 30-year reign. It wasn't simply about the wasted liquor, explained a producer who spoke with Carson later. Johnny believed in a sacred, unspoken pact between the host and the talent, mutual respect and professional conduct. Shelley had shredded that contract in the most humiliating public manner imaginable. This banishment had severe repercussions for Winters' trajectory. The Tonight Show was the ultimate megaphone for any star selling a movie, and being barred from Carson's couch meant vanishing from the radar of millions of consumers. Her film offers were already dwindling due to her age and her notoriety. As a difficult diva, noted a Hollywood agent well-versed in Winters' portfolio. Being exiled from The Tonight Show severed one of her final lifelines to the mainstream public. She could still find work, sure, but her era as a headline-grabbing superstar was effectively finished. Winters later owned up to the incident, telling a reporter in the 1990s that the punishment fit the crime. "I was in a dark, bad place back then," she confessed. "Johnny had every right to never want to lay eyes on me again." This saga highlights something crucial we discuss here at Legacy Unmasked, Carson's zero-tolerance policy for anything that threatened the tightly controlled ecosystem of his show. He might overlook a bad joke or a boring story, but physical aggression toward the king in his own castle, that was the one sin for which there was no salvation. Tommy Newsome, and pay him a compliment about his sparkling personality. Laughter. 5. Rich Little, the inexplicable vanishing act of one of Carson's top regulars. For more than 10 years, the master impressionist, Rich Little stood as one of The Tonight Show's most dependable stars, walking through those curtains more than 30 times throughout the 1960s and 1970s. His pitch-perfect vocal mimicry of Hollywood legends and politicians turned him into a fan favorite, and to the outside observer, he seemed to be one of Johnny's golden boys. But then, in a twist fit for a mystery novel, Little simply disappeared from the roster entirely. There was no screaming match, no controversial interview, and no on-air disaster. He just ceased to exist in Carson's world, sparking one of the most confusing silent bands in the program's long history. Rich's exile from the late-night King's Court wasn't like the other volatile. Blacklistings clarified a talent coordinator who handled bookings during that era. You couldn't pin it down to a single dramatic event or argument. Instead, he slowly transformed into persona non grata for reasons that remained opaque to the vast majority of the production crew. In stark contrast to other band celebrities, Little's career didn't stall. He continued to thrive on rival networks and in Vegas, remaining a dominant face on television well into the 1980s and beyond. He was everywhere, it seemed, except on Johnny Carson's stage. The intrigue only grew because Little himself appeared completely baffled by the sudden freeze-out from the very host who had once championed his talent so aggressively. "I sat by the phone waiting for it to ring, and silence was the only answer I ever got," Little confessed in a 2010 retrospective. Eventually, the reality sank in, though Johnny never gave me the courtesy of a direct explanation. According to insiders with intimate knowledge of the dynamic, the ban originated not from a public scandal, but from a festering personal disdain that Carson began to harbor for the impressionist when the cameras were off. Johnny found his behavior increasingly grating behind the scenes, revealed a producer who worked side by side with the host. Rich had an irritating tendency to stay in character, firing off impressions relentlessly, even when the red light was off. What the audience loved for a tight 10-minute set, Johnny was forced to suffer through for hours during technical rehearsals and commercial breaks. This inability to just be a normal human being reportedly clawed at Carson's nerves as he deeply valued genuine authenticity in his private interactions and grew exhausted by what he saw as Little's desperate constant need for validation and applause. Johnny was once heard muttering, "Does the man even possess a voice of his own?" following a particularly draining pre-show briefing recalled a writer who happened to be within earshot. It wasn't delivered as a quip. There was genuine venom and fatigue behind the words. However, the final nail in the coffin was likely professional rather than personal. According to multiple high-level sources, Carson became steadfastly convinced that Little was becoming lazy recycling old material on the show and dusting off impressions and gags he had already delivered during previous visits with barely any modification. Johnny was absolutely militant about having fresh content, explained a veteran staffer. He possessed a near-photographic memory for comedy routines and could identify in a heartbeat if a performer was double-dipping. With Rich booking so many spots, Johnny began to detect the repetitive patterns that might slip past the casual viewer at home. To a perfectionist like Carson, this perceived lack of effort was a cardinal sin. He staked his reputation on The Tonight Show's quality control and demanded that his guests, particularly the frequent flyers, bring their absolute A-game and brand new material every single time. Instead of having a messy confrontation, Carson quietly ordered his booking department to simply cut the cord. Whenever Little's agents called to pitch an appearance, they were met with polite excuses about full schedules or the show pivoting to a new creative direction. It was a soft ban, subtle but permanent, noted the talent booker. Johnny never slammed his fist and said, "I banish him forever," like he might have with more volatile guests. He simply remarked, "I think we've had quite enough of Rich for the time being." That time being stretched out to infinity. The situation with Little was particularly telling because it exposed Carson's absolute zero-tolerance policy for creative stagnation. While other hosts might have happily kept booking a reliable, applause-generating machine, regardless of the material's age, Carson demanded constant evolution and novelty from everyone who stepped onto his set. Johnny wasn't just chasing ratings points, observed a former executive at NBC. He was chasing excellence. If he sensed a performer was coasting on their past glories or refusing to put in the work to write new bits that was viewed as just as offensive as being rude or unprofessional, Little finally pieced together the truth about his exile decades later, when a former Tonight Show employee detailed Carson's private frustrations in a documentary. Little has since vocalized his deep regret that he was never afforded the chance to fix the problem. "I could have written entirely fresh routines if I had just known that was the roadblock," Little lamented in a 2019 interview. But in the entertainment industry, you are rarely given the courtesy of knowing why the gate slams shut. It just shuts. Said, "I'm about the height of a shotgun and just as loud. Would you give a warm welcome to Truman Capote 6, Truman Capote the Incoherent?" A catastrophic appearance that signaled a tragic end. Truman Capote stood as one of America's literary titans, the genius, who penned masterpieces like Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. His razor-sharp intellect and unique persona made him a beloved fixture on the talk show circuit throughout the swinging 60s and early 70s. However, by his guest spot in 1975, Capote was trapped in a harrowing cycle of substance abuse that was beginning to bleed into his professional life with devastating consequences. What was scheduled to be a standard promotional chat rapidly deteriorated into one of the most agonizing moments in television broadcast history. A stage manager on duty that night recalled the tension, noting, "You knew disaster was looming the second he stepped out." Truman was visibly stumbling. His words were thick and slurred, and his gaze was glazed over. Johnny Carson appeared deeply worried before Capote even managed to navigate his way to the guest chair. Carson, who was no stranger to a stiff drink, held a rigorous standard of professionalism when the cameras were rolling. Although he enjoyed his own indulgences off camera and occasionally cracked jokes about it during his monologues, he demanded that his guests remain sharp, coherent, and broadcast ready. Johnny felt a profound duty to the viewers who welcomed him into their living rooms. Every night, a producer for the show explained. He refused to insult his loyal audience by parading a guest who was clearly chemically incapacitated. As the interview commenced, Capote's impairment became excruciatingly undeniable. He fought to string together simple phrases, frequently lost his narrative thread in the middle of a word, and began making crude remarks about fellow icons that were strictly forbidden on network TV. Johnny exhausted every tool in his formidable interviewing playbook, according to a director who watched the train wreck happen. He pivoted to brief, easy questions. He attempted to steer Truman back to safe anecdotes from the pre-interview notes. He even tried to play it off as a comedy routine. Absolutely nothing worked. The situation reached a critical mass when Capote launched into a disjointed, rambling tale about a Hollywood gathering that drifted into graphic details that violated the broadcast standards of the era. Carson immediately cut him off and threw to a commercial break much sooner than the rundown sheet called for. During the blackout, multiple sources confirmed that Carson confronted Capote face-to-face regarding his state. Johnny leaned in close and spoke in a steel whisper, "Truman, you are not well tonight. We are going to end this segment now." A nearby stagehand remembered hearing. Capote attempted to protest his sobriety, but his speech was so garbled that it only served to validate Carson's decision. When the program returned from the break, Carson abruptly wrapped up the conversation and dismissed Capote. The slot, originally booked for 10 minutes, had clocked in at barely 4 minutes in extremely rare truncation in the annals of the show. The fallout was immediate and severe. Carson personally ordered his talent coordinators to ensure Capote was permanently blacklisted from The Tonight Show, a decree that remained in force for the rest of his tenure. Johnny was seething, but his rage wasn't entirely directed at Truman, clarified a producer who spoke with the host afterward. He was furious with Capote's entourage for letting him walk on stage in that state, and at himself for failing to spot the red flags before the taping began. This ban dealt a crushing blow to Capote's remaining years in the spotlight. The Tonight Show was the ultimate engine for book sales and celebrity relevance. Being exiled from Carson's couch meant vanishing from the radar of millions of potential buyers. For an author like Capote, who was already fighting a losing battle with writer's block, this excommunication was fatal, noted a literary agent close to the situation. His final significant publication, Music for Chameleons, saw barely a fraction of the promotion it would have received with Johnny's blessing, and the sales figures suffered accordingly. What made the Capote ban so pivotal was how it underscored Carson's ironclad rules regarding substance abuse on his stage. While he could overlook many scandals showing up blatantly wasted, was a level of disrespect that Carson deemed unforgivable both to his own legacy and to his viewers. Johnny wasn't passing judgment on Truman's addiction, observed a close friend of the host. He was safeguarding the sanctity of his show. There is a massive distinction between having a cocktail to loosen up and being unable to form a sentence on national television. The Capote incident stood as a stark warning to other stars who might think about using liquid courage before facing Johnny. The edict from the king of late night was simple: show up messy and you will never sit on television's most prestigious throne again. Before we dive into the next scandal here on Legacy Unmasked, we have a massive 2-part special featuring one of the most explosive acts in TV history. It is a hot show, truly a hot show, and it involves number 7, the Smothers Brothers and the political firestorm that led to their exile. Tom and Dick Smothers were far more than a comedy duo. They were cultural lightning rods whose variety show on CBS became legendary and was eventually axed for its fearless resistance against the Vietnam War and its biting political commentary. Their progressive stance and refusal to standing up to the powers that be transformed these siblings into counterculture icons, yet made them absolute pariahs to the old guard. Carson, who treated his personal political leanings like state secrets to maintain the Tonight Shows. Universal Appeal navigated a tricky dynamic with the duo. He undeniably admired their comedic brilliance, having booked them repeatedly. throughout the 1960s, but as the cultural rift in the United States widened, their aggressive style began to make him squirm. Johnny stayed in the middle of the road on purpose, noted a writer from his inner circle. While he would happily roast leaders from both sides of the aisle during his opening remarks, he refused to let the Tonight Show mutate into a soapbox for polarizing agendas. The Smothers Brothers, however, viewed their humor as a weapon for social change, creating an unbridgeable gap in values. The tension finally snapped during a 1970 cameo that swerved violently from lighthearted comedy into heavy activism. According to witnesses on set, Tom Smothers hijacked his time slot to broadcast what was essentially an anti-conflict manifesto, completely abandoning the playful Chat Carson had anticipated. Johnny's demeanor shifted, instantly remembered a cameraman on duty that evening, while his trademark grin stayed plastered on his eyes turned to ice. He absolutely loathed being blindsided by preachy content, particularly when it strayed so far from the pre-interview agreements. Consummate professional that he was, Carson wrapped up the bit, without letting the audience see the friction. However, insiders claim he was incandescent with rage the moment he stepped off stage. Too much headache for the payoff. Carson allegedly muttered to his showrunner, coining a phrase that would become his verdict for any performer who brought unnecessary drama to his meticulously produced empire. What ensued wasn't a loud public excommunication like some other stars suffered. Rather, the Smothers Brothers were cast down into what the crew dubbed Carson Purgatory. There was no official decree banning them, yet strangely the invitation simply evaporated. It was a shadow ban before the term existed, clarified a booking agent active. In that era, their names remained on the theoretical roster, but whenever someone pitched them, management always found a convenient excuse for why that specific week was fully booked. Eventually, their agents read between the lines and quit trying. This silent exile persisted for years, with the duo managing only the rarest of cameos on The Tonight Show, a far cry from their former residency. According to Tommy Smothers, those scarce opportunities came with handcuffed strict orders to steer clear of anything meaningful. We were effectively gagged. Tommy confessed in a 2010 retrospective. We could show up once in a blue moon provided we stuck to harmless tunes and fluff. The second we attempted to say something with substance, the door would slam shut again. The entire Smothers Brothers debacle was a defining chapter underscoring Carson's ruthless commitment to keeping The Tonight Show a zone of pure escapism rather than a political battlefield. While contemporaries like Dick Cavett were diving headfirst into the era's controversies, Carson intentionally curated his hour as a sanctuary from the noise. Johnny didn't necessarily oppose what the brothers were saying, observed a former NBC suit. He was simply vetoing their attempt to hijack his variety show for their crusade. He reasoned that the audience tuned in to unwind from the day's struggles, not to be lectured about them. This strict code often placed Carson at loggerheads with artists who felt their creativity and their activism were one and the same. It was a friction that persisted throughout his reign as the king of late night. The Smothers incident laid bare Johnny's true loyalty. Remarked a TV historian, he pledged allegiance to the laugh, not the cause. Any guest who failed to respect that boundary found themselves swiftly erased from the guest list. As you will discover in the coming weeks and years, some bridges once burned are gone forever. For more deep dives, subscribe to Legacy Unmasked. 8. Morton Downey Jr., the shock jock who crossed the line. If Johnny Carson was class, Morton Downey Jr. was the anti-matter. Loud, abrasive, intentionally offensive, and radically political. His syndicated program, which exploded in popularity during the late 1980s, involved Downey screaming in people's faces, blowing smoke directly at them, and whipping his studio crowd into a mob-like frenzy. While Carson built a legacy on polite discourse, Downey thrived on absolute mayhem. They were the polar opposites of broadcasting philosophy, a clash that became excruciatingly obvious during Downey's catastrophic visit to The Tonight Show. It was a chemical mismatch from the start, recalled a producer from those days. Johnny was the guardian of old-school elegance. Downey was the living, breathing avatar of trash TV that was beginning to emerge. To Johnny, this guy wasn't just a nuisance. He was a walking natural disaster, threatening the very soul of broadcasting. It all went down in 1988, right when Morton Downey Jr.'s infamy was peaking. Bringing him on was a massive bone of contention behind the scenes. Half the staff screamed that handing Downey a mic just validated a trashy style far beneath their dignity. Johnny only gave the green light with extreme hesitation. A talent coordinator spilled that Carson felt an obligation as the king of late night to let this new cultural oddity state his case to the masses. It was a choice. He would rue almost instantly. The second Downey strutted out the air in the studio grew heavy enough to cut with a knife. Instead of sitting down like a civilized human being, Downey ignored protocol completely. He worked the crowd fishing for cheers and prowling the set like he owned the joint. A cameraman recalled Johnny's face turning absolute stone cold. The crew, having spent years decoding his moods, spotted the microscopic tells immediately. The skin around his eyes tightened and his jaw locked up just a fraction, flashing red alert signals that everyone in the building understood. Everyone, except for the oblivious guest. Downey didn't just cross the line, he tried to erase it. He hijacked the interview, cutting Johnny off to shout directly at the audience instead of talking to the man behind the desk. When Carson tried to pivot to a genuine conversation about Downey's past and where his combativeness came from, the guy just dodged and weaved with louder, more hostile outbursts. A director watching the train wreck noted that Johnny emptied his entire bag of tricks to salvage the segment. He threw out jokes, asked point-blank questions, and even tried softly challenging the guy's tactics, but absolutely nothing could crack the obnoxious character Downey was dead set on playing. The situation went from bad to toxic when Downey started trash-talking other hosts by name, insinuating they were too spineless to tackle the real gritty issues like he did. The subtext was loud and clear. He was taking a dig at Johnny right to his face. A stagehand in the wings noticed that while Johnny's trademark smile stayed plastered on the light behind his eyes, went out. He leaned back in his chair, a subtle shift the crew knew meant he had mentally checked out. The guest was no longer worth his energy. Carson cut the segment short, offering a goodbye that was technically polite, but freezing cold, the kind he saved. For total disappointments. Once the camera stopped rolling, sources say Johnny didn't hold back. He was rarely that raw. But he reportedly turned to his producer and snapped, "That is not television, that is a cheap circus act. And let me tell you, this studio is not the big top." While they never issued a press release banning him, Downey was effectively exiled from the kingdom. He never set foot on that stage again during Carson's reign. Insiders confirmed his name was quietly scrubbed from every potential guest list, vanishing as if he never existed. An ex-executive clarified that this wasn't just a petty grudge, it was philosophical. Downey symbolized a toxic shift in the industry that Carson found repulsive a slide away. From intelligent dialogue into screaming matches, trading sharp wit for sheer volume. That disastrous interview was more than just bad TV. It was a snapshot of a dying era clashing with a violent new one. It highlighted a massive generational rift, marking the rise of the aggressive, in-your-face style that would eventually consume the entire medium. As one critic noted, Johnny was the last gentleman standing in a world rapidly losing its manners. Downey was the canary in the coal mine, a loud, chain-smoking warning that Carson's brand of thoughtful, measured entertainment was being pushed aside for something uglier and far more divisive. Carson shutting the door on Downey wasn't just about disliking a rude guest. It was a declaration of principles. He was drawing a line in the sand for the standards he upheld until his very last night on air. For more deep dives into the hidden battles of television history, make sure to subscribe to Legacy Unmasked. Deeply entrenched in, alongside the rigorous principles he fought tooth and nail to uphold until the very moment his final